I like to honor everybody's time as much as I can, and it is at that time. And so I would like to begin. And the one thing that I'm very excited tonight in my mind, it's an anniversary. This is our 24th Forum for Discussion.
Wow.
Ken is the 24th individual we have brought to try and talk about all of the different avenues of peace and how we can bring peace to the world. Many different ways, and Ken Scott was an exciting addition. So, good evening, Rotary colleagues and friends in peace. I'm Jim Holder, chair of the District 54 Peace Committee. Tonight, we'll hear about war crimes and what everyone needs to know. We are very fortunate tonight to have Ken Scott, an attorney that has prosecuted some of the Justice Department's largest criminal cases, a prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal at The Hague, and so much more. Ken, take it away. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Jim. And it's my pleasure to be with all of you this evening. And I welcome all of you here, and I hope that you'll find it an interesting topic and something that we can have plenty of time to discuss. I have a fairly short presentation, I think. And hopefully there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers or a general discussion. And I really encourage everyone to if you have a question, jump in at any time. Obviously, we're in Zoom mode, so I'll try to be attentive to whoever might speak up or hold up a hand or something like that. But forgive me if I don't necessarily see you. And some of you aren't on audio or are on videos or visuals. So unless you speak up, I probably won't see you. What I wanted to do this evening, and when Jim and I talked about this, is just to this is an introductory course in war crimes law. And I think one of the things you'll find out about it pretty soon is that at least at this level, I mean, obviously it gets to much more complicated levels, but at the level we're going to talk about this evening, I think you're going to find that overall it's fairly intuitive. The rules are sort of what you would think they would be. These are the most basic sort of fundamental building blocks of war crimes law. And so if you get these pretty well under your belt, in an hour from now, you'll be on your way to becoming a good war crimes lawyer. Well, not quite, but not really, but something like that. So what I'm going to do, I have a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm going to try to share my screen. So bear with us as we try to regroup on that. And then, as I said, please speak up or make yourself known if you have questions anywhere along the way, and I'll do my best to try to see that and to respond to any questions you have. And then, as I said, I hope we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So again, it's my pleasure to be with you, and let's see if we can get the share screen working here. How's that look, Jim?
Beautiful, beautiful.
All right, so we're talking about the fundamental principles of something called international humanitarian law. It used to be called, well, it was most recently formerly called the Law of Armed Conflict, sometimes abbreviated as LOAC. And even before that, historically, it was the Law of War. I still prefer myself the Law of Armed Conflict because international humanitarian law sounds to me like something that humanitarian organizations like Food for the World or Bread for the World or World Vision or somebody else like that does. That sounds like humanitarian to me. But for some reason, some years ago, the war crimes people decided, I guess they didn't like that. Maybe war sounds too nasty. So they came up with the term international humanitarian law. But that is the correct terminology. If you do any reading or if you talk to people about it, and if someone says IHL, they'll be talking about international humanitarian law, but really what we're really talking about is the law of armed conflict. What you can or cannot do in war, or at least what you shouldn't do, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and the principles by which warfare is carried out. Let me hang on here. So very, very briefly, just all international law comes from one of two sources. It's either treaty law, and in our context of the law of armed conflict, we're really talking about something such as the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 are based on treaty, and there's a number of different treaties, and it's been updated since that time. And so that's treaty law. When you think of treaty law, think of contract law. If any of you are lawyers or even not, just basically contract law. Those who enter into a contract are bound by the contract. Those who enter into a treaty are bound by the treaty. People who are not parties to the treaty or parties to the contract are not bound. So there are some limitations there. Fortunately for us, in terms of the Geneva Conventions are one of the rare treaties in the world where every country, essentially every country in the world, has acceded to them. Every country in the world, even the newest country in the world, South Sudan, has agreed to the Geneva Conventions. So they apply globally. And in addition to treaty law, the rest of other international law comes from something called customary law. And I think of common law or common practice. And this is law that develops over time based on the actual conduct of states. How do they conduct themselves in global affairs? How do they conduct themselves in warfare? And over time, rules emerge that become part of what's called customary law. Not critical to our discussion tonight, but I just thought it would be worth starting with, where does this international law come from? So really we have two sources: treaty law, such as the Geneva Conventions, and we have customary law, which is an entire body of just that, the laws and customs of war. Everyone is bound by customary law as well. So between the Geneva Conventions and customary law, all the rules we're going to talk about this evening apply essentially globally to every country, to every actor, or at least every state actor. We could get into the whole issue of non-state actors. Is someone like ISIL, is someone like Daesh or ISIS, they're not a state, are they bound by these principles? Well, by customary law they would be, but that raises a more complicated question than we're going to spend most of our time on this evening. Now, just by way of a quick history lesson, there's a somewhat surprising long history of warfare codes of conduct dating back hundreds and perhaps even thousands of years. It might be a bit surprising at first, but I guess as long as there's been warfare, which is pretty much forever, there's been some people trying to establish rules of conduct and how war should be conducted or not conducted. Just as simply as one example, there's something called the Lieber Code. On April 24th, 1863, U.S. President Lincoln issued General Orders Number 100, which were the instructions for the government of the armies of the United States in the field, commonly known as the Lieber Code, after its main author, Francis Lieber. The Lieber Code set out the rules of conduct during hostilities for Union soldiers throughout the U.S. Civil War. It remains today the basis of most of U.S. war crimes law. The Lieber Code also inspired other countries beside the United States to adopt similar rules for their armed forces, and has been used as a template and as an example for other countries and up to more modern times in establishing such codes and rules. So that's just one example of about 100 years, 140, 160 years ago of a rules of an attempt to govern war by conduct of rules. Whoops. So these are fundamental principles, as I said, of IHL, of international humanitarian law. The references that I'm looking at come primarily from something called the International Committee of the Red Cross, based in Geneva, Switzerland, their database of customary international humanitarian law. And again, as I was discussing a few minutes ago, for our purposes, basically these rules that I'm about to talk about apply to everyone or all states in the conduct of armed conflict. The very, very first rule, and the most basic rule of all, is called the principle of distinction. The parties to the conflict must at all times distinguish between civilians and combatants. Attacks may only be directed against combatants. Attacks must not be directed against civilians. And as I say here, as I say to my, when I've taught this course at the university level and law school, one of the things, there's a lot of complicated areas in the humanitarian law and the war crimes law and crimes against humanity, genocide. There are a lot of difficult areas. There are a lot of gray areas. This is not one of them. This is a bright letter rule, bright letter rule. There are no exceptions to. Attacks must never, ever target civilians. They cannot be directed at civilians, ever. No exceptions. And we'll talk about that some more as we continue through the slides. Rule 4 is the definition of armed forces. The armed forces of a party to the conflict consist of all organized armed forces groups and units which are under a command responsible to that party for the conduct of its subordinates. Importantly, then, if we talk about the protection of civilians, well, who are civilians and who are combatants? When the definition of combatants is all members of the armed forces of a party to the conflict are combatants, interestingly enough, except for medical and religious personnel. Medical and religious personnel are not considered to be combatants, I suppose for perhaps obvious reasons. They're not actually engaged by their duties, by their responsibilities. They're not actually engaged in combat operations in the sense of carrying a weapon and actually engaging in combat themselves, although they are in fact surrounded in combat, but not carrying out combat themselves. So Rule 5, the definition of civilians. Civilians who are persons who are not members of the armed forces. The civilian population comprises all persons who are civilians. So it's a fairly limited, broad and pretty straightforward definition. All persons who are not members of the armed forces, as I just defined those to you a moment ago. So based on what we've now only seen a couple of slides, so already, what is wrong with what's going on in Ukraine? Anyone want to take a guess at that?
Killing civilians.
Killing civilians. That's right. It's mass. There are massive war crimes. As I've been talking to friends, as I talk about this, it's not even a close question. Russia is on a daily basis is engaged in war crimes in Ukraine by attacking civilians, and as we'll see in a moment, also civilian objects. So it's absolutely blatant. There's no gray area here. These are attacks on civilians. It's a war crime. Now, civilians can lose the protection from attack. Civilians are protected against attack unless and for such time as they take a direct part in hostilities, in which case they become combatants for so long as they act in that capacity. Well, again, that's fairly intuitive. If you pick up a rifle and engage in combat, you have changed your status. You are no longer a civilian. You've now become a combatant. And guess what? If you're a combatant, that means the other side gets to shoot at you. Sometimes, are you better off being a combatant, or are you better off being a civilian in a given situation? I guess any of us might be faced with making that decision. But it's again fairly intuitive.
Ken, there's one question
Yes.
that's of interest. Putin is claiming he's not at war. So who has to decide if it's war or not?
Well, there's actually a definition of armed conflict under humanitarian law, and I don't have a slide on that. I didn't come with a slide on that, but it's a fairly straightforward definition. Any armed conflict, either internal, this would be considered what's called an interstate armed conflict, because you've got two sovereign states. You have the state of Ukraine and you have the state of Russia. And so they're engaged in what's called an international armed conflict. And I know he wants to call it a special operation, but it's an armed conflict. It's definitely an armed conflict. Yeah, but good question. Good question.
Mhm.
So rule number 7, excuse me a minute. Yeah, rule number 7, it basically applies the same things to not only to civilian persons, but what's called civilian objects. The principle of distinction between civilian objects and military objectives. The parties to the conflict must at all times distinguish between civilian objects and military objectives. Attacks may only be directed against military objectives. Attacks must not be directed against civilian objects. So there again, pretty straightforward. That's kind of what you would expect the law, you would hope the law would be, that you can't attack civilian objects. Insofar as definition of military objectives is that insofar as objects are concerned, military objectives are limited to those objects which by their nature, location, purpose, or use make an effective contribution to military action and whose partial or total destruction, capture, or neutralization in the circumstances ruling at the time offers a definite military advantage. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, but that is the definition of a military objective or a military object as opposed to a civilian object. So by exclusion, civilian objects are all objects that are not military objectives. So going back to our Ukraine example, is a missile attack on a supermarket in downtown Kyiv a war crime? Anyone think that it's not? No, it is. That's a war crime, another war crime. So if you're attacking against civilian objects, then like a recreation area, a supermarket, a school, a church, all sorts of things, again, those are blatant war crimes. Unless they're like just the same way as we said with the individual, whether you're a combatant or a civilian, if a civilian object takes on the role or becomes a military objective, then it becomes a legitimate military target. The answer is different. The answer we talked about a moment ago is different if the Ukraine army had 2 tanks sitting in the supermarket, which is a sort of a silly illustration, but you get what I mean. Then the presence of those tanks in the supermarket would convert that to a legitimate military, or at least could convert that to a legitimate military target. So again, you've got to look at the actual situation at the time. But the general rules and what we've established so far is that attacks on civilians and attacks on civilian objects are generally illegal or against war crimes law.
And there are those that would ask, that's not a lot different than what the US did in Dresden in World War II?
Well, in reality, all sides did things in World War II that frankly we're not supposed to do today. I mean, both on the Allied side, on the Axis side, there was large-scale bombing of cities, Dresden, London, wherever else you want to talk about, by all sides. I mean, the Allies were bombing German cities and factories, and they were bombing civilian areas in England and elsewhere. That shouldn't happen today. If we were going, and again, it shouldn't be happening in Ukraine. So that is a place where the law of war has changed since World War II. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so then there's something, we've talked some more about targeting. You can't target civilians. You can't aim your gun at a civilian intentionally. You can't aim your artillery or your missiles or other weapon systems at civilians or civilian objects. But there's also something called indiscriminate attacks. And indiscriminate attacks are also prohibited. And an indiscriminate attacks are those which are not directed at a specific military objective, or B, which employ a method or means of combat which cannot be directed at a specific military objective, such as a particular weapon system. For example, if you're engaged in combat or fighting in a built-up urban area, and you're using a weapon system that's very inaccurate, it's accurate plus or minus 500 meters. You really shouldn't be, by indiscriminate attack law, you shouldn't be using that system, because if the accuracy are plus or minus 500 meters, you may as well just as well hit civilians as you will a military target. So that's an example of an indiscriminate attack, and this as laid out here. Also, indiscriminate attacks are those which employ a method or means of combat, the effects of which cannot be limited as required by international humanitarian law. And consequently, in each such case, these are of a nature to strike military objectives and civilians or civilian objects without distinction. And that's, again, an indiscriminate attack. So you can't target civilians, and you also can't kill civilians by indiscriminate attacks. And sometimes people ask me then, well, if you can't target civilians and you cannot kill them indiscriminately, how is it that what accounts for civilian deaths? I hate to say lawfully or legitimately, but in this sense, how do civilians die in armed conflict? And the answer to that question is that ideally, and I mean, we're talking about wartime and people do get killed, including civilians, but ideally the only time a civilian should get killed if it's lawful or in this sense legitimate, but very, very, very unfortunate collateral damage that's incidental to some legitimate military action. That's the only time civilians should be killed. And in this regard, and I'll stop here for a minute and say, I don't know if any of you have ever seen a movie. It's called Eye in the Sky. If you have not, if you've seen it, it's a really great movie. I really encourage all of you to find it on some platform. It's a 2015 Hollywood movie. Number one, it's very entertaining. I mean, it's first-rate. It's a first-rate Hollywood movie with top actors in it, but it also illustrates throughout the movie exactly everything we've been talking about so far. So Eye in the Sky, find it on some platform and definitely watch it, especially after now that you've been through this, you will have been through this presentation.
And there's another question on infrastructure. Where does infrastructure lie? Electric power plants, gas lines?
That's a very good question. And generally speaking, they retain their character as civilian structures. And actually under a body of law called starvation law, which is really a misnomer because it includes a lot more than starvation. If you attack the means that are the objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as water, food sources, power sources, you can be guilty of the crimes crimes involving what's called starvation. That's a bit of a tricky area, Jim, because sometimes you can see where as a military commander might want to take out those things. But again, primarily speaking, they are considered to be civilian objects and should not be attacked.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So then one of the other really basic, in addition to the principle of distinction, one of the other most basic principles is what's called the principle of proportionality. Launching an attack which may be expected to cause incidental, here we are talking about incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated, is prohibited. So even military commanders have to actually weigh, even if it is legitimate military action, is the risk of substantial incidental deaths, does that so much outweigh any military advantage to be gained that the action would still be considered illegal? So there's a balancing factor there that commanders are supposed to take into account and say, well, there is in this situation a legitimate military target, but in order to if I carry out what I want to do, if I use this weapon system or this many troops or do it this way, the loss of civilian life may be so high that it is disproportionate to any military advantage to be obtained. So that's the principle, essentially the principle of proportionality. And by the way, I might just stop here and just say that these laws are actually, well, they should be applied. I say they are applied, they should be applied. And I think in the American military, they are applied. I was on a panel, a speaking panel some years ago with an Air Force JAG. And he, as part of his duties, he had been assigned in a combat role to a command unit. And it was not at all uncommon that what would happen, the commander in charge at some point would turn to him, a lawyer in the field, and basically point to a situation, whatever on the ground, and basically ask him in the military vernacular, can I kill that? And the lawyer would have to express a view whether that was a legitimate military target and consistent with the rules of law, the laws of armed conflict or not, and applying the principle of distinction, applying the principle of proportionality, and say yes or no. You can attack that or you can't attack that. So these are rules that are actually applied in the real world. These aren't just things that are talked about in the classroom. This really happens in the real world. And I think it's important for people to realize, at least obviously it's not happening in Kyiv in terms of the Russian side, but it should be happening in all militaries that are governed by the laws of armed conflict.
Ken, we have a question by Greg Pod.
Okay.
And real quick, how close is North Korea to being in violation of some of these principles?
Well, they haven't, they're launching, making all these missile launches, landing in the ocean. They're probably not violating these principles just yet. I'm just trying to think of a scenario. Probably not yet, Greg. Not yet.
Well, with this technology, some of those missiles could go off course, I would think.
Right. Yeah. Well, if that's the case, that would go back to what we were talking about. Again, if it was an indiscriminate system and they were actually fired it, and it was their systems were so inaccurate that it hits a civilian town or city, then I think there's a good argument that could be a war crime. Yeah, if that were to happen, if that played out that way, then I think you'd have a strong argument that it could be a war crime. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So continuing on, and again, to some extent, some of the rules become a bit repetitive when you get the general idea. So Rule 15 is called the principle of precautions in attack. In the conduct of military operations, constant care must be taken to spare the civilian population, civilians, and civilian objects. All feasible precautions must be taken to avoid, and in any event, to minimize incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. So again, it's a pretty straightforward rule that, the responsibility on commanders to comply with these rules. Constant care must be taken to spare the civilian population. Yeah, again, not what the Russians are doing in Ukraine.
Ken, we've got a question by Barbara Mueller.
Yeah, hi, Barbara.
Hi. Civilian objects, would that be something like the crops that they're destroying?
Yes, that would fall. Yes.
Well, there you go.
Again, that would fall. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that's a war crime to me, destroying
Yes.
crops.
It is a war. That goes back to what we were saying a few minutes ago, but talking about starvation. If you intentionally destroy crops, burn crops, foodstuffs, warehouses where foodstuffs are being stored, all of that can be a war. That can be and is a war crime in many situations. And that's actually something I've been working on lately. And I was just in The Hague a couple of weeks ago talking about starvation and this kind of conduct as a war crime. And again, that's how, as you point out, that's happening in Ukraine as well. Yes.
And then Ken, Bob Maroney has a couple of questions.
Okay.
Yes, a couple occur to me. Earlier, you were talking about the principle of proportionality, where you're not supposed to cause excessive damage to civilian infrastructure, all beyond the perhaps value to war. It would seem to me that that would imply any use of nuclear weapons is automatically a war crime. And even if the person uses a nuclear weapon on you and you retaliate with a nuclear weapon, you are guilty of a war crime.
That's a very good point, Bob. And that argument's being made and has been made and is being made at various points along the way. I don't know There was an International Court of Justice case some years ago that talked about the use of nuclear weapons. And I don't remember the exact result of that right now, but that part of that argument has been made. And I mean, I think it's a very good point. I mean, the nuclear weapon is the ultimate indiscriminate weapon. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, as a matter of morals and the use of the weapons and why they shouldn't be used.
The other question I have about North Korea's behavior, where there's many shots of missiles. When the missile passes over other people's nations, like over Japan, this isn't necessarily a war crime, but wouldn't this be perhaps defined as a intrusion of national sovereignty?
Sure, I think that's right. I think, as you say, I'm not sure that by itself would constitute a war crime, but it does seem to be violating national airspace. Yeah, I think that's right.
So what are there any international implications for violating national sovereignty?
That's a little bit outside my immediate bailiwick, but my guess is that the South Koreans have been protesting this. I mean, to the extent they cross over, South Korean territory. If it's a shot that's going straight out from North Korea into the open ocean beyond any sort of in the international waters, so to speak, then I guess you wouldn't have that problem. But if they're flying over South Korea, I can only imagine that South Korea would be protesting in the strongest possible way.
Well, Japan is the one that has been protesting occasionally.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Probably not a war crime just yet, but something that shouldn't be happening for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Leanne Huntington has a question.
Hi, Leanne. I think you're muted.
She's asking, do any of the rules of armed conflict address gender-based violence specifically, or is it just implied?
No, it's absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely within a strong body of strong part of international humanitarian law. I mean, rape, sexual violence, gender-based violence are all war crimes. All give rise to war crimes, and at the tribunals, at all the tribunals, they've been those laws have been actively enforced or prosecuted. In the Yugoslavia situation, rape and unfortunately rape and sexual assault and sexual violence was commonly charged, and so it's definitely very much an important part of the law. Yeah.
And Peggy Halderman has a question.
Okay.
I like the fact that we have a set of principles.
Mm-hmm.
The elephant in the room for me is, so what, who cares when we watch Putin be indiscriminate? What are the implications or the consequences, and what is the process for bringing meaningful consequences against the perpetrators?
Well, that is the €1 million question, so to speak. There are tribunals around. The International Criminal Court exists, of course, in The Hague, and it has jurisdiction over the Ukraine conflict through a series of agreements filed, documents filed by the Ukrainian government. So the ICC, the International Criminal Court, does have jurisdiction and is undertaking investigations, and has been now for some months, actually on the ground in Ukraine. Of course, and cases will be made. I'm sure that cases will be made. Evidence will be collected, and evidence will be put forward, and charges will be brought by the ICC in The Hague. The real question, of course, becomes how do you bring the accused parties before the court? And that's the real trick. I mean, at the lower levels, at some point, the Russians might turn over some lower level soldiers or officers, perhaps. Some of them will be found in third countries. Of course, the real question, of course, is there some way that Putin would ever be brought before the court? Right now, that sounds like a long shot, but on the other hand, I will tell you a story, and a couple of people on the line in the presentation in the group here might have heard me say this before, but I was a prosecutor at the Yugoslavia Tribunal for 14 years, and when the tribunal was first established by the UN in 1993, people said it'll never do anything. There'll never be any cases. There'll never be any investigations. And then in reality, there were investigations. And when there were investigations, people said, well, no one will ever be charged. Well, in fact, a lot of people did get charged. And then they said, well, no one's ever going to get convicted. And then a lot of people did get convicted. And a lot of people said someone like Slobodan Milosevic would never be brought before the court. And he was brought before the court. Unfortunately, he died before the trial was concluded. But we can only hope. I guess there is no guarantee that we can bring these people before the court, but that's what we have to hope for. And there is a process in place to do that. Yeah, that's a huge question. And hopefully as time goes by, we'll be fortunate enough for some developments to happen so that we can get our hands on some of these people.
And a good point on if there is definitely war crimes, who really is responsible? Is it the general in charge in the field? Is it upstairs, or at what level can you prosecute?
Yeah. You can prosecute at really every level in theory. Well, you can prosecute from the foot soldier all the way up to the Minister of Defense or the president, if you can get custody of them. In most of the tribunals, there's usually some language in the tribunal mandate or the international court mandate that talks about bringing to justice the most senior responsible persons. So what these tribunals want to do is they really don't want to try privates. They don't want to try foot soldiers. They want to work their way up the chain of command to mid-level commanders and higher level commanders to top commanders, up to the level and up to the levels of senior government officials. And as you were as in the bio of me that you were good enough to share, I mean, and when I was at the Yugoslavia Tribunal, I successfully prosecuted a prime minister, 2 defense ministers, and 2 army chiefs of staff that we were able to bring into custody. And so you can prosecute people at essentially every level, assuming you have the evidence on your side and assuming you can get a hold of the people. Yeah. Anything else right now? I'll move on to a couple of last slides, and then we'll continue on with as many questions as people have.
You can move on.
Okay. Oops. Well, Rule 16, again, just continues on this same line of thought. Each party to the conflict must do everything feasible to verify that targets are, in fact, military objectives. You can't just say, well, I'm going to lob a shell over there, and there's probably some military targets over there somewhere, so I'm just going to send a shell in that direction. Well, that would not be consistent with target verification. I mean, to the best of your ability. I mean, no one's necessarily saying you can do the impossible here, but great due diligence has to be shown in applying all these rules as far as you possibly can, under the conditions under often difficult conditions, of course, in a war context. But nonetheless, these are the rules. Again, Rule 15. This comes from the Geneva, also comes out of the Geneva Conventions. Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions. Belligerents must do everything feasible to verify that objectives against which they are directing attacks are neither civilians nor civilian objects and are not subject to special protections. Interestingly enough, because someone says, what if you don't know if someone's a civilian? Well, the answer is IHL, International Humanitarian Law, provides that in case of doubt, a person must be considered a civilian. If it's that close of a question that you don't really know, is this person standing in front of me or a 1,000 meters away, is that a civilian or a combatant? Tie doesn't go that it's a combatant. The tie goes to it's a civilian. And so until you can prove otherwise, you have to presume or should presume that the person is a civilian. Similarly, in case of doubt, it must be assumed that an object normally considered a civilian object has not become a military objective. And these are at least the starting points of analysis. Those are the points that you start from, and then you work your way from there to determine if you do have a combatant or you do have a legitimate military target. Sort of like indiscriminate attack, Rule 17 provides that, and concerning the choice of means and methods of warfare, each party to the conflict must take all feasible precautions in the choice of means and methods of warfare with a view to avoiding, and again, in any event, to minimizing incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. Really the same thing. Again, the best off the top of my head, the best example of that is the one I used earlier about indiscriminate attacks. If you're fighting in a congested area where you have mixed military and mixed combatants and civilians, and you're using a weapon system that is highly inaccurate, it would not be proper to use that weapon in that context, because you're probably going to kill at least as many civilians as you are combatants. So again, that would be an example where you made the wrong choice of means and methods of warfare contrary to the law of war. And then principle of precautions against the effects of attacks. Again, the parties to the conflict must take all feasible measures, all feasible precautions to protect the civilian population and civilian objects. So I think it's pretty clear now what these basic fundamental principles are. International humanitarian law is a huge body of law, but these are the most fundamental and basic rules that we have to govern the law of armed conflict, to govern armed conflict. And of course, they're frequently violated in any number of situations. And of course, as we've been talking this evening, extensively being violated in Ukraine, unfortunately. So I think that concludes the slides. And we still have, I think, a good amount of time. I think, Jim, based on whatever your usual practice is, at least time for maybe a few more questions or discussion.
And there's a lot more of them. One of the things that I would point out, I don't know if everybody's aware, we have 26 wars going on in the world currently.
Wow.
All of our attention and knowledge and awareness is on Ukraine. There are 2 or 3 wars that are killing more people than in Ukraine, but but Ukraine is getting the attention, and we could ask why, but that's another forum for discussion.
Yeah.
We're open for questions. David, you have your hand up? David Sleasley?
Easily, yeah. I was wondering if you could apply these concepts to the January 6th incident.
Wow. It's probably not an armed conflict. In order to have a war crime, you have to have a war. And under rules of armed conflict, it doesn't probably rise to that level, unfortunately. It's a very interesting question. But under the law of armed conflict, there are certain things like supposedly domestic, up to a certain point, domestic turmoil, domestic unrest, riots are generally not considered to rise to the level of armed conflict for the purposes of applying international law. If it continued to be at such a large scale and it really something closer to a civil war did break out, then war crimes law could apply. But probably in that particular incident, no, not yet.
So we're talking about duration mainly?
Duration, the nature of the parties, the extent of the combat, how broad a geographic area, how organized the forces are on each side, those sorts of questions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Ken, do you mind taking down your screen now so we can get good facial contact?
Sure.
And we'll continue on. There's some good questions in the chat.
Okay. We back together now?
Oh, this is great.
Okay.
Do you think the perpetrators of human rights abuses in South Sudan, and specifically the soldier generals who are responsible for widespread rape being reported by human rights organization will ever be brought to justice?
Well, I certainly hope so. I've been, as some of the people in the group know, I've been working on South Sudan issues since at least 2014. So, and I've done quite a bit of work there on the ground and long distance. Yeah, I sure hope so. The domestic courts, the national court system is badly damaged by the conflict, and also politically, the judiciary is not a very strong body there, and unfortunately, there's a lot of corruption. Sadly, according to the peace agreements, there's now been 2 peace agreements, one in August 2015 and one in September of 2018, both of which provided for the creation of what's called a hybrid international court, which would sit someplace in Africa and would be a mixture of South Sudanese judges and prosecutors and international judges and prosecutors, which would then specifically investigate and prosecute such cases. Unfortunately, the government has been steadfastly opposed to the creation of the court and has done nothing, even though they signed the treaty twice. They signed this agreement, the peace agreement, twice, promising to do so. They've done more than drag their feet. They've actually been dramatically hostile to the creation of the court. They even hired an American lobbying firm to make sure that the court would never be established. And so we've got that hurdle to get over. So at the moment, we don't have, the domestic court system is really not an answer, except at the very lowest level. A few foot soldiers have been prosecuted, including for rape. Not nearly enough, but a handful. And we don't have the hybrid court has not been established yet. And unfortunately, the ICC does not have jurisdiction because South Sudan is not a party to the court. So it leaves us at the moment with a very bad situation because we don't really have an effective court that has jurisdiction over the situation. That's something I've been working on for years. And unfortunately, the international community does not bring enough sustained pressure in the situation on the actors. The African Union is supposed to assist in establishing the court, to work with South Sudan to establish the court. The African Union has been totally ineffective and has no political will to do so. And the government, again, has been hostile to it. But again, hope springs eternal. And I hope at some point, some court will gain jurisdiction and being able to bring these people to justice.
Before I forget again, Ken, in all of your involvement with the United Nations, did you ever have opportunity to work with Robert Mueller?
I've worked briefly with Robert Mueller on a project some years ago. It wasn't in an international context, but I've worked with Mueller and have a lot of respect for him.
We'll talk later. I asked you because his wife is on this call.
Oh, well, very good. Hello. I won't say anything bad then, for sure.
He was
No, highly rated and highly effective, and
he
I
was
think
very good
unfortunately
friends
hands were
with-
tied. I'm sorry.
Exactly. Thank you. And he was very good friends with Ben Ferencz. In fact, we had
Yes.
many meals with each other. Ben Ferencz, as you know, was the Nazi criminal lawyer, and he did convict after he got that. Miracles happen in these
Yeah.
kind of courts. And when Ben Ferencz was told, well, we can't try 3,000 people, he
Yeah.
said, no, we have 30 seats. We can try 30 criminals. And so they picked the worst. And then right before the trial started, somebody found the journals of these 30 people. And
Wow.
he would say, are you guilty of? And the guy would say, not guilty. And he said, well, in your journal on this date, this is what you said you did. And so these miracles to help us keep peace on our planet happen. And if anybody's interested, Ben Ferencz is 102 years old now.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
doing good keeps you alive. And I just wanted to report that to you. He's a dear friend. He's on my podcast. He's on number 34. Jim's on my podcast. I have had such wonderful people on my 100 podcasts now, peacekeepers and people who really know that war does not work and we haven't got a way to stop them yet.
We will hear more about that next month. Bob Maroney, you have a question.
Oh, yes, good, Bob.
Yes, thank you. There were a couple things that occurred to me as I was listening, and I think it bothers a lot of us that we have international laws, but in many cases, as far as the nation is concerned, there are no ways to impose consequences.
Yeah.
So it occurred to me, and this is all sort of thought thinking more than anything else, that perhaps as people sign up for these international laws, that they also have to deposit some kind of value that they can then jeopardize if they break
Yeah.
the laws. And
Awesome,
so
yeah.
it's occurring to me that if every nation that was part of the international court or a part of the law of war had to place in some kind of effective bank somewhere
Yeah.
$500 billion, then they would be less likely because they could be held consequent,
Yeah.
at least in the pocketbook.
At least financially, yeah.
Any thought
Well,
about that?
That's a very interesting point. I get, it'd be like posting a bond. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I have not specifically thought of it. It's a very interesting thought. And yeah, it is very difficult to bring these states, to hold states responsible unless they, you know, act to some extent of good faith and undertake responsibility. But you're right. Interesting idea. Yeah.
I am very fond of my nation, America, and the United States, but it sometimes really bothers me that many of these international laws that are put up, like mine safety laws for mines in warfare,
Mhm.
we say we're great for it, but we refuse to sign it. And I was just thinking about what happened in Iraq at the end of our time there. The Iraqi government said, if you're going to put peacekeepers in our country, we want your soldiers to be subject to our laws concerning rape and harm and hurting of other people.
Sure.
And the US said, oh, we couldn't do that. We couldn't let our American soldiers be possibly under Iraqi courts. Therefore,
Right.
we're not going to stay at all.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
seems to me to be a little bit hypocritical.
Well, I I think it is. I think it is. Yeah.
And good
I mean,
question.
no, I was just going to say, I guess the American military's response to that would be that we hold our soldiers responsible ourselves under you know, the military code of justice. That's what they would say. Now, you know, I'm just saying, I'm not necessarily saying that's right, but that's kind of the answer you get.
One
We will
question.
take care of them ourselves. Yeah. I'm sorry, Jim, go ahead.
Go ahead. Forgive me for, anyway, there was another question pertaining to how is every soldier aware of all of these laws?
They're supposed to be training in the American Armed Forces. It is part of the training that officers and enlisted personnel receive. I don't know, I can't give you that they have so many hours of training, but it is definitely part of the education and training they receive. I know at the military academies, I've actually lectured and taught at the Air Force Academy, and they are given specific training in the law of armed conflict, and it's one of their basic courses. Yeah. Any other questions, comments?
Time for one more good question.
Yeah, when were these laws established?
Well, again, over time, the Geneva Conventions came after World War II in 1949, and that's the single biggest body of treaty law. Some of the customary law has been around. Some of it's been around for probably 100, 150, at least 150 years, as it began in the late, it began to develop in the second half of the 19th century. Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's been pointed out by some that we had the United Nations that was formed in 47 or 48, depending on what year you want to, the final, which said no more wars. Let's stop all wars.
Yeah.
Then a year later, we had the Geneva Convention that said, well, let's form the rules of war. So it was there any real commitment to the UN, but
Yeah.
UN has been, Ken, we thank you so much for sharing your extensive knowledge and your concerns for these critical issues. It's been
you.
extremely rewarding, and I've certainly enjoyed it. And we see a lot of hand claps. So Ken, we thank
Thank
you
you.
very
Thank you
much.
very much. It's my pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you, Ken and Jim.
Oh, you're
Yeah,
welcome.
Jim, thank you.
But next month, we're going to hear from Barbara Gon Mueller. Barbara is the chair of the Rotary Action Group for Peace. She's the vice president of the Santa Barbara chapter of the United Nations Association. She's the producer of the Peace Podcast. She is the publisher of the Peace Community Magazine. And that's just before she has her coffee in the morning. So you'll hear much more about her next month. So in the meantime, thank you all for joining, and we will see you all next month.
Thank you very much.
And
Bye-bye.
Good job.
Thank you. Thank you.